Thank you again, Andres, and all the neuroscience team at and the Faculty of Medicine at Javeriana for the invitation to come here. It was a personal visit to Colombia, and it became a nice excuse to have an event like this that actually grew to be this special event in memory of Emil. And I'm also especially honored to be a moderator or a commentator for this panel. I'm not a social psychologist, and I'm just starting to get close to social psychologists when I met Emil and now collaborating with Boaz. But I'm pretty much an amateur and just a motivated and passionate amateur on this field, trying to include social psychology into experimental and behavioral economics for public policy. You may wonder, the panelists, why is an economist actually talking about, what is she going to talk about here? And I first met Emil some years ago in one of his visits in Colombia, and he was introducing his measurements on empathy and empathy barriers. And first I asked him, it was fascinating, but also puzzling to me, and I asked him at the time, and we started the discussion about it, and I'm going to ask you, the panelists, as well, what will be the first point of 4 that I have for the panelists. I'm not going to comment, but actually ask questions to them, so we can learn more from you. And this point was, well, what would you expect if all these tasks or these questions in terms of trying to measure prosociality or even empathy are incentivized? That means that in the case of, for example, for Risarta's work, when you're measuring prosociality, what will happen if the respondent actually knows that there will be some kind of benefit to the person, of the outgroup person? Or for the case of Laura, what if the kids actually know that instead of stickers from one picture to another one, they know that there are 2 children waiting for crayons that he's going to decide what to do with? And what will be the difference in terms of those measures compared to the measures that you already use? And Emil was very open to this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue. And then further on, we start collaborating in evaluating media intervention used not only to capture or reducing empathy barriers, but also prosociality measured in economic terms. I mean, incentivized and using behavioral economics behind. And I'm not talking only about prosociality in terms of being generous with reciprocity, for example, or trust, but also cooperation and preferences for redistribution. That means that this kid in one of Laura's study will literally decide if he's going to take resources from the in-group and send them to the out-group based on merit, luck, or nothing. That will be the control condition. So we started this work, and I am now also working on impact evaluation of art-based interventions to reduce empathy barriers and promoting prosociality and building, interventions for peace building. And then I will go to my second point, and all of them are for the 3 of you, the panelists. The second one is about the psychological mechanisms behind these interventions. For Risarta and Laura, we would love to learn more about that, about what is behind these interventions, the design of those interventions that led to those outcomes, and how, for example, in Laura's model, the personal, how these interventions will affect the personal, the murals, all these photography workshops, and how the personal will affect the relational in this development peace building model. Or maybe, Laura, you may have already or a micro model of development peace building, if there is any, or it should be there any. For Johanna, I would like to know how the collective victim beliefs will enter into these mechanisms, how this will become a mechanism that we could use to understand not only the correct outcomes, but actually the outcomes led by the interventions that social psychologists are using, like, for example, narratives or even media interventions. And my last point, obviously the economics one, I had to say it, is in terms of cost efficiency. So how these interventions are, I mean, not only in terms of measurement, it's not only efficiency in terms of measurement of, for example, I know, Johanna, because, I mean, being in the field, it could be sometimes very costly to capture all these measures on collective victim beliefs or any other complex measure. So sometimes the measures are even more expensive than the interventions that we will have. So how would you deal with this? And also in terms of the interventions, of course, how we could, or is it possible to scale up these interventions or measurements on an agenda of peace building policies? So for prosociality and validated surveys of prosociality, that's an alternative. For example, I am using now validated surveys instead of using incentivized measures that are very costly. Now I'm getting into the validated questions that are very similar to the experimental economics ones. So thank you, and I am all ears. We are.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Polanía. So we're going to give the floor to our professors, the panelists, in the same order they presented, if that's okay with you, professors. So we're going to start now with Resarta. So we're going to share screen. If you can turn on your camera again and confirm that you're hearing us properly. No? So maybe, I don't know, Professor Biliali or Laura Taylor, are you, we can see you connected. Can you speak and maybe turn your camera for us, please? Thank you, Professor Biliali.
Sure.
We're gonna start. We're gonna start with you, Professor.
Are we responding to the questions?
No, if you have any thoughts on these questions or you want to share.
So it was a bit. I think I missed a part of it because because of the language, I had to go on another device to hear the English version. So sorry about that, but I think I captured much of it. Thanks so much for these comments that are very welcome. And you mentioned, I think, relevant to my presentation, the issue of I think the type of measures that you're asked that we ask, and whether it makes a difference if we had asked, if people would have been aware about the benefits that this kind of intervention would have on the out groups. And you are right. So we of course, and this is related to your last point, I think, about the cost efficiency. For instance, in the kind of questions that we ask and the type of measures that we include, we have included the measures that we have, the kind of outcomes that we kind of theorized that that were relevant to the intervention, and also the type of measures that also were cost efficient. So we couldn't include too many outcomes. And also one big actual limitation of a lot of this work that I presented is that we actually don't have the kind of behavioral outcomes that are actually quite important. So we look at behavioral tendencies and attitudes, perceived norms, but behavioral measures are quite expensive, actually. I know economists have had a longer history in getting, large sources of funding to get, huge to run large experiments and measure behaviors in the field, but that's something that, I think probably we need to kind of learn more tricks from behavioral economics, I guess. So I would agree with all of these points. I think this is, the points is also related to a comment that Johanna mentioned regarding how a lot of this work, our focus, in terms of the outcomes of our interest, comes from, as the researchers, often, of course, it's in collaboration with the communities, but, there might be biases because we are only assessing a few select groups of, outcomes that are of our own interest. And maybe if we had surveyed the population about, what actually the outcomes of interest are in terms of, the changes that they want, maybe they would have selected different types of outcomes. And it's also relevant to, the issue of unintended effects that I also mentioned in my talk, that we might capture certain effects on some of the outcomes of our interest, but we don't know, right, the effect that these interventions have on things that we don't measure. So I think I'm not sure that I'm really giving, I think I'm just extending probably on your comments, because I agree with you. Yeah, I would also, agree that we need more interdisciplinary collaboration to address some of these issues.
And yeah, maybe I'll go next. I think you said in order. And so just to briefly say your point about like what is meaningful as a resource is really important. So, stickers in this age are things that kids care a lot about. Teachers often use those to reinforce the behaviors. In other labs, they've used really innovative components of school supplies. So again, something that's meaningful and salient for that age group. We've also done things with money and chocolates and jellies and loads of other kid-friendly games. So you're right, it needs to be something that's meaningful and that it has kind of a context of zero sum, right? So in conflict settings, something for the other is often perceived as a loss for my group, right? So when we think about housing or school investments, there is a limited pie. And so, one of the things that we've done with adolescents is look at kind of broader forms of allocation. So essentially adaptive dictator games, if that's kind of the reference point. And in terms of the last point, maybe just to keep it brief and make sure Johanna, I'll say I keep it brief and then I'll keep talking. But so second to last point. So when we think about the cost of an intervention, and I think behavioral economists do this very well, is the cost of not intervening, right? There's a societal cost for a generation of children who maybe don't finish school, right? And so some of the work that I've done actually with folks in Colombia, which is like a non-governmental organization for early childhood education, what we've done in this larger network is documented if we don't intervene in early childhood, so things like Bienestar Familia, or like these kind of family-focused interventions in early childhood, specifically around peace building, here's the societal costs, again, a generation later. And so I think we need to balance both the cost of the intervention with the cost of not intervening, the other half of that coin. And really, I think what Rosarta's work shows, and what I try to model somewhat with mine, is using existing structures and tweaking what they do, right? So Rosarta was working with an existing radio program and affecting the content. So it's not recreating the wheel. Similarly, I do most of my work through schools. So kids are going to schools, the government funds schools, teachers are already in classrooms. So how can we work with the teachers in the classroom who are already there getting paid by the state to tweak what they do to get a better outcome? Right. So I think these things at scale is thinking of the other half of the coin and also working within existing structures versus adding a whole bunch of new interventions. And then finally, I think what is really important, so you're asking about like mechanisms, and I do think that developmental peace building model, is a paper we published. That model is like from 2002 was based on 15 years of work and continuing to inform. And that is essentially trying to change the narrative of the media, right? So this is, we know that when people show youth in political violence, it's as perpetrators or as victims, right? They're either at the, throwing the petrol bomb, or it's the traumatized youth that have been child soldiers. And what we're trying to show is there is a third path, at least, right? This is recognized by the UN as well from 2015. Youth are active. So we're just kind of trying to make a space in the media, in the social consciousness, right? That youth are actually doing these active things. And I think Johanna's kind of the qualitative work at the end of there was saying, we are not associating with these narratives. And like the more we as academics can make space for that in the media with our evidence, I think that also then gives young people the chance to continue to act and get recognized for their own agency. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much for the comments, and this so far has been super engaging. Thanks.
I couldn't figure out, unfortunately, the translation channel, and I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately, so I don't know if there is someone who could briefly tell me the main question. Is it me?
Johanna, I think it was, I asked in
The
English.
psychological
Can you hear me?
mechanisms and the cost of intervention.
I'm not sure I understand the question in relation to my talk, sorry.
Can you hear me, Johanna?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay, so actually I asked them in English, so I think the link was, you were in the wrong link.
Oh, okay.
But don't worry, I will summarize. So because the first one is about incentivized measures for these beliefs, for example, in your case of collective victim beliefs. I because of experience too, I know it's very expensive to capture these measures. I mean, to implement these measures and have a grasp of these beliefs, no, in the population. So my question, one of those is, in terms of scaling up, how we can use these measures to actually categorize a community or a country in terms of collective victim beliefs, for example, and how these beliefs actually are. The first question was how these beliefs are ingrained on a micro model of development, peace building. How we could use them as a mechanism to reduce empathy barriers or to increase prosociality. What would be your thoughts about that? And
that's a difficult question. Sorry, I think something got interrupted.
No, that will be it. That will be it.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if something was interrupted or not. I know we're at time, and this was a really complicated question, so I'll just say that I think with collective victim beliefs, research on it shows that we're not really quite there yet to say what should be done in terms of intervention, because the research that I've done with non-representative samples and convenience sampling in the community on a smaller scale, right, already shows that there's so much complexity in how people make sense of it. And if we jump ahead too quickly and develop interventions based on one collective victim belief or the other, we are probably missing a lot of the important complexity, and we might also be, as the data shows, like offending, alienating some participants, perhaps creating some unintended negative effects, like what Izauta was talking about. So I think, before we go to that step of thinking about how this knowledge on collective victim beliefs can be used in interventions, we need more research first, looking at, for example, how prevalent these different types of collective victim beliefs are, and again, focusing on in which context might they actually be harmful. So in what context is it, for example, harmful? We think inclusive victim beliefs are positive and will predict pro-social outcomes, but depending on the context, inclusive victim beliefs used by high power groups, for example, could also be used to kind of like legitimize or deny what happened, deny the kind of violence they themselves committed, and instead draw more attention to how they are allegedly the same as other victim groups, right? So yeah, that might be a cop-out answer, but I think the research is still in its infancy.
Thank you. Thank you, Johanna. Well, why Andres hasn't kicked me out yet, so I can ask you something else. Johanna, we are here recently was presented to everyone in Colombia what we call the Comisión de la Verdad, which is the Truth Commission. So we found in developing this report about everything that happened in the conflict. There are actually, we found, I could observe that the reports that were presented by the military were exclusive collective victims beliefs, and they were the victims, and the report was only based on all what they suffered. And then we have the other report by the civil society victims, talking about their own wounds and what happened to them. And it's now we're in the second stage, that is using this in order to reconciliate, helping to build peace after the peace accord. What would you think we could do in terms of, when we have already the two truths, no? The two sides, and all of them are exclusive. Will be actually maybe better to have another report presenting both reports in an inclusive way. That will be actually helpful for that. What would you think?
Yeah, it's difficult to answer without knowing the specific, context again of like the actual objective scale and the power relations. In some settings, inclusive victim beliefs are helpful, but in other settings, if a high power group with objectively less, harm claims inclusive victim beliefs, then that can have also negative effects on the other side, right? And it can be used to ignore the harm that they committed. So I think it depends. In some contexts, inclusive victim beliefs can be helpful, but in other cases, they will be, again, seen as offensive by the other side, and they can serve to cover up responsibility for harm as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.